In this last video for this unit, I'm going to talk a little bit about some issues with Kantian deontology, some problems. So remember, at the end of the previous video, we saw this argument, and there was the idea that, well, the Kantianism is correct. Why? Well, on the one hand, which moral theory is true, the one that best explains our moral views, and which one does that? Well, the Kantian view, supposedly. Why does the Kantian view do that? Well, among other things, we said that the two principles, the principle of humanity and the principle of universalizability, support our intuitions about particular cases, but now we're going to see that maybe that's not right, that maybe the principle of humanity and the principle of universalizability have trouble with some of these cases. And so we're going to go back to the O'Malley and Charlie problem cases and ask, well, how does the Kantian actually fare with these cases? How does Kantianism do in describing these cases and explaining what we should do? So let's first think about the principle of humanity, which says never treat humanity in yourself or in another person merely as a means, but treat it also as an end. So you have to, this principle says you need to respect other people's abilities to make decisions for themselves about their own lives. And it looks like, so in the O'Malley's case, imprisoning the child to benefit the whole city does not treat the child as an end. It uses the child as an end, does not treat the child as an end, uses the child merely as a means to benefit the rest of the city. Pushing someone off the bridge does not treat them as an end. It says, I'm going to take over your body and use it in the way that I see fit, and it's going to benefit all these other people, but I don't allow, if I push the person off, I don't allow them to make a decision about what happens with their body. Finally, if I redirect the trolley, am I treating the person as an end? Well, probably not. I'm sending in their direction something that's going to damage their body that they don't want to happen to their body. So the principle of humanity does seem to, there's some issues with that last one, but the principle of humanity seems to do okay with capturing our intuitions about these particular cases, assuming you think that the pushing and the exploitation of the child are wrong. The problem is that the principle of humanity is vague. Is it always wrong to use another? When? What if using another would save 5 billion people? Would it then be wrong to use another person? What is the scope of using another person? When do you infringe on their autonomy and when don't you? The principle of humanity doesn't tell us those things, and therefore, while it seems like it might be plausible, it's far short of what we would want from an ethical theory. The principle of universalizability is supposed to make the principle of humanity precise. So let's think about how good a job it does. So consider the O'Malley's case. What is the maxim by which you would act if you were going to imprison the child? You would say, I will imprison another if doing so will, greatly benefit the city. So is this maxim universalizable? Well, you might think, no, it's not. Here's why. If everybody adopted that maxim, right, then maybe I would be the one that is imprisoned. Maybe actually, I would have to imprison myself anyway. It says another, but if others were following the maxim, then I might end up getting imprisoned, and that would be really bad for me. It would be really bad for me if I was imprisoned. So it's not rational for me to will that this maxim be universally accepted. On the other hand, you might think, no, actually, it is universalizable. I'm much more likely to benefit from this maxim than I am to be harmed by this maxim. There's only one person who needs to be imprisoned, and everybody else gets benefited. Am I more likely to be the person who's imprisoned or the person who gets one of the people who gets benefited? I'm much more likely to be the person who gets benefited. So actually, it's a little bit scary to live in a city where you could get imprisoned for everybody else to be benefited, but it might be worth a gamble, right? We make gambles all the time. I gamble with my life every time I cross the street, right? That's why I look both ways, and but sometimes the car accidents happen anyway. We make gambles all the time. What's wrong with this gamble? Why is it such a terrible gamble for me to say, yes, I'll risk life imprisonment for the possibility of living in this wonderful city? So that's not to say that it's morally correct. It's to say that the imprisonment maxim actually looks like maybe it is universalizable. So if we think it's wrong to imprison the child, then the Kantian theory has a problem, because at least the universalizability theory has a problem, the universalizability principle, because on the one hand we think wrong to imprison the child, but on the other hand, the maxim looks like maybe it is universalizable, and so according to the Kantian theory, it's actually okay. Well, let's look at the trolley problems for a second. I'll put another in harm's way if doing so will benefit many more others. You might think, no, that's not universalizable. Again, right, like I could be pushed or hit into the, I could be pushed into the way of the trolley. I can get hit by the trolley. And so it's not rational for me to will that everyone act in this way. But maybe it is universalizable. Maybe it is rational for me to will that everyone act in this way. Why? Well, because again, I'm much more likely to benefit, right? In the trolley scenario, there are 6 people. There's the person who's sacrificed. There are the 5 people who will be killed, and then there's the other person who would be killed instead. It's much more likely that I'm one of those 5 than I am this one. So it's a 1 in 6 chance I get killed when I wouldn't otherwise be, but a 5 in 6 chance that if I was going to get killed, now I'm saved. Well, that looks like pretty good odds, right? It's if I'm in the scenario at all, I'm more likely to be one of the people who's going to get killed if there's no action. So I would rather that 5 out of 6 times someone else dies, 1 out of 6 times I die. That sounds like a pretty good deal. So, again, shouldn't I take this gamble? Doesn't having this gamble make my life better off? So, in all 3 of these cases, it looks like is the Omelas maxim universalizable? Yeah, maybe. I'm going to probably benefit. I take a little bit of risk, but there's a good chance I'm going to benefit. Whereas the humanity maxim says, no, you can't use the child as a means, merely as a means to other people's ends. Same with pushing. Maybe it's universalizable, but it's certainly using the person who's pushed as a means and merely as a means. Same thing with redirection. So in the redirection case, again, I don't actually I'm not actively using the person to whom the trolley gets redirected towards, but I'm not taking account of their rationality and their desire to not get smashed by the trolley. So these cases actually illustrate 2 problems for the Kantian. So one problem we've already seen, the principle of humanity is vague, but now we've seen 2 new ones. The principle of humanity and the principle of universal law appear to not always agree, but they're supposed to for Kant. And the principle of humanity seems to allow apparently immoral actions. It seems to allow imprisoning the child, pushing the large person off the bridge, redirecting the trolley. Now, again, there may be some disagreement about whether or not any particular one of these are immoral, but it seems like at least some of them are, but the principle of universal law appears to allow all of them. Right, why? Well, because, it's fair to do all these things. We're each putting ourselves because we're willing to sacrifice. If we say, look, I'm willing to allow other people to act in this way and sacrifice and take the risk of them sacrificing me for the benefit that I might get of other people being sacrificed for my good. That's fair, but it's still using people. So the idea of fairness and the idea of not using don't seem to coincide. It may be that treating people's ends requires treating them fairly, but there's more you have to do to treat them as an end than just treat them fairly, and at least treat them fairly in the way that the universal law principle would require. So, okay, let's summarize all of what we've seen. So deontology, Kantian deontology, does explain some of our moral intuitions. We think certain acts are wrong even though they maximize utility. Explanation, they seem to violate some people's autonomy, and doing so makes them wrong. And one way to violate people's autonomy, like in the lying promise case, is by acting unfairly in ways that we couldn't all adopt. But there may be other ways of violating someone's autonomy, like in the Omelas and trolley problem cases. So it's not clear what the boundaries of autonomy are. Right? Universalizability seems to not always tell us. It's necessary to respect someone else's autonomy. Maybe it's necessary to treat them fairly, to act on a universalizable maxim, but that's not enough. And, right, there are maxims that are universalizable but still violate autonomy. And also, separately, it's not clear how to balance autonomy and outcomes. At some point, it's okay to push the person off the bridge if you're going to save 5,000 people, or 5 million people, or 5 billion people. How many? It's not clear how we'd answer that question. So, you can violate autonomy sometimes, but we don't know when, and we don't have an argument for the value of autonomy. So the Kantian view is limited. Utilitarianism seems problematic because autonomy is important, and utilitarianism doesn't recognize its value. But Kantianism is limited. We don't know why autonomy is important. acting on universalizable maxims may be required ethically, but it's not enough to act to be sure that you're acting ethically. You need to do more to respect others' autonomy, and it's not clear how we would do that. So both of the ethical theories we've looked at so far seem to have problems. They have attractive features. They both seem to say, yeah, here's some values like happiness and autonomy, and they're ethically important, but it's hard to actually spell out how they're ethically important in different cases. So in the next unit, we'll be looking at a couple of alternatives to Kantianism and utilitarianism, then in some sense say the sort of theory building that they're trying to do, maybe that's not such a good idea after all, as we can see, given the fact that they haven't succeeded.